Her words struck a chord within Kale. He thought about humanity's achievements, the art, the science, the moments of kindness amidst chaos. We also create, he added, music, stories, inventions, things that make life worth living. A flicker of interest passed over Nixfra's features. Creation, yes, we value that too. She gestured toward the window, where Kel saw Jolari artisans shaping glowing materials into sculptures and structures. Our society thrives on balance between creation and destruction, order and chaos. Without it, we falter. Kale nodded slowly, beginning to see glimpses of the Jolari culture. They weren't mindless predators, as he'd initially feared. They were complex beings with values and traditions, much like humans, but beneath Nixfra's composed exterior, Kale sensed a shadow of doubt, a hesitation that hinted at deeper troubles. Before he could probe further, Nixfra dismissed him with a wave of her hand. You may explore the palace freely, within limits. My guards will ensure your safety and compliance. As Kel wandered the halls later, accompanied by the ever-watchful drones, he noticed whispers among the Jolari. Some glanced at him with suspicion, while others seemed curious. He overheard fragments of conversations spoken in low tones, words like voidborn and threat. Though he didn't fully understand their meaning, the tension in the air was palpable. By the end of the day, Kale realized something important. Nixfra might hold all the power, but she wasn't invincible. Something was troubling her. And whatever it was, it could affect not only the Jolari, but possibly Kale himself. Outside, Nixfra and her warriors watched in awe as the hive mind crumbled, its tendrils retracting and dissolving into nothingness. The Voidborn, deprived of their central control, fell lifeless to the ground, their corrupted forms crumbling into ash. Nixfra wasted no time. She sprinted toward the collapsing structure, her heart pounding with dread. Kale, she called telepathically, her voice tinged with desperation. To her immense relief, she found him staggering out of the wreckage, his face pale but determined. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his clothes were singed, but he was alive. Nixfra rushed to his side, steadying him as his legs gave out beneath him. You did it, she said, her voice soft yet filled with reverence. You saved us. Kale managed a weak smile, his body trembling from exhaustion. We saved each other. With the immediate threat neutralized, the group made their way back to the palace. Along the way, Kale noticed subtle changes in the landscape. The blackened crystals were beginning to glow faintly with their original bioluminescent hues, and patches of greenery sprouted where barren earth had once dominated. Life was returning. Back at the palace, Kale received medical attention from Jolari healers, who used advanced techniques to stabilize him. Though physically weakened, he emerged with heightened senses and partial telepathic abilities, a side effect of prolonged exposure to the hive mind's energy. These changes unsettled him at first, but Nixfra reassured him they were gifts, proof of his resilience. As the Jolari celebrated their hard-won victory, Nixfra turned her attention to rebuilding her fractured society. She offered Kel a permanent place by her side as an honorary member of the Hive, an ambassador between humans and Jolari. Together, they vowed to ensure lasting peace. Kale accepted, knowing his journey was far from over. He had started as an accidental intruder, but now he stood as a hero revered by two species, and somewhere deep inside, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he truly belonged. Inside the hive mind, Kale felt as though he had entered a nightmare. The walls, or what passed for walls, were alive, pulsating with veins of crimson light that throbbed in sync with his heartbeat. Shadows writhed around him, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to mock his presence. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and every breath carried the taste of decay. But worse than the physical discomfort were the whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere, slithering into his mind like venomous snakes. Each voice carried fragments of doubt, fear, and despair. Some sounded like his own thoughts, twisted into cruel parodies of themselves. Others belonged to strangers, perhaps former Jolari consumed by corruption, pleading for release or screaming in agony. It was an assault on his sanity, designed to break him before he even reached the core. Kale clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. He repeated Nixfra's words in his head. "You are stronger than your fear." Over and over, he chanted them silently, using them as a shield against the chaos threatening to overwhelm him. The deeper he ventured, the more intense the visions became. Memories flashed before his eyes. His childhood, moments of failure, times when he doubted himself. Then came fabricated horrors. Images of Earth burning, Nixfra falling lifeless to the ground, the Jolari reduced to ash. Every step forward felt like wading through quicksand, each movement heavier than the last. But amidst the torment, something unexpected began to emerge, a flicker of clarity. Kel realized that the hive mind wasn't just attacking him, it was showing him its pain. The corruption wasn't merely destruction, it was suffering. Somewhere within this monstrous entity lay traces of the Jolari who had once been whole, their essence fractured but not entirely lost. This realization gave him strength. If he could disable the core, maybe he could free them, not just destroy them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kale reached the heart of the hive mind. At its center floated a massive orb, pulsating with dark energy. Tendrils of corruption radiated outward, connecting it to the smaller nodes scattered throughout the wasteland. The source of the Voidborn's power, and their curse, was here. Kale approached cautiously, his weapon raised. As he drew closer, the orb emitted a low hum, growing louder until it vibrated through his entire body. Suddenly, a figure materialized before him, a shadowy version of himself, its eyes glowing red. "You cannot win," the shadow Kale sneered, its voice layered with malice. "You are weak. You always have been." For a moment, Kale faltered. The creature's words struck a nerve, dredging up every insecurity he'd ever buried. But then he remembered why he was here, not just for himself, but for everyone counting on him. For Nixfra, for the Jolari, for humanity. "I'm done listening to you," Kale growled, raising his weapon. With a single, decisive shot, he fired at the orb. The blast struck true, causing the structure to shudder violently. The shadow Kale let out an ear-splitting scream as it dissolved into smoke. But the victory was short-lived. The orb didn't shatter, it began to destabilize, releasing waves of energy that threatened to consume everything. Alarms blared in Cal's mind, warning him to flee. Instead, he planted his feet firmly, gripping the controls of his weapon with both hands. "There's only one way to end this," he muttered under his breath. Channeling all the energy left in his weapon, he unleashed a concentrated beam directly into the orb's core. The resulting explosion sent shockwaves rippling through the hive mind, disintegrating the corruption and severing its connection to the Voidborn. When the dust settled, Kale collapsed to his knees, his body battered and exhausted. His vision blurred, and his ears rang from the force of the blast. Yet somehow he remained conscious. Around him, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift, replaced by a faint glimmer of light. One by one, the warriors made their way across, testing each step carefully. When it was Cal's turn, he hesitated, staring down into the abyss. The void below seemed endless, pulsating with a malevolent energy that whispered promises of despair. For a moment, he froze, unable to move. "You are stronger than your fear," Nixfra's voice echoed in his mind, calm yet firm. She stood on the other side of the bridge, her multifaceted eyes locked onto his. Taking a deep breath, Kale forced himself to take the first step, then another, and another. By the time he reached the other side, his legs were shaking, but he'd done it. Nixfra gave him a brief nod of approval before turning her attention back to the path ahead. Finally, after what felt like days of relentless marching and fighting, they arrived at their destination. a colossal hive mind structure rising from the center of the wasteland. Its surface was a labyrinth of shifting patterns, pulsating with the same crimson glow as the crystals scattered throughout the land. Tendrils of corruption snaked outward, connecting it to smaller nodes that radiated waves of oppressive energy. "This is it," Kale murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the hive mind. "The source of the corruption." Nexphra turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You know what must be done." Kale nodded, steeling himself for what lay ahead. "I'll go in alone. If I can disable the core, it might weaken the Voidborn enough for you to finish them off." "No," Nexphra replied sharply. "It is too dangerous." "We will." "There's no time to argue," Kale interrupted, surprising even himself. "You need to focus on protecting everyone else. Trust me. I've got this." For a long moment, Nexphra studied him, her gaze piercing. Then, reluctantly, she stepped aside. "Return to us, Kale Armitage, or all will be lost." With that, Kale stepped into the hive mind, disappearing into the swirling mass of corruption. Inside, the air was suffocating, filled with whispers that clawed at his mind. Visions of failure and despair assaulted him, trying to break his resolve. But Kale clung to one thought: the faces of those counting on him. Nexphra. The warriors. Humanity itself. "I'm not giving up," he whispered, gripping his weapon tightly. "Not now. Not ever." Her words ignited a fire within the crowd. Cheers erupted, echoing off the crystalline walls. Kale felt a surge of pride and fear as he looked around at the faces of those who trusted him. They weren't just counting on him to succeed. They believed in him. Later that evening, as the group prepared to depart, Kale noticed a faction of dissenters lingering at the edges of the gathering. Their body language was tense, their whispers sharp. One of them caught his eye. A tall, serpentine creature draped in dark robes. It glared at him with unmistakable hostility. "They do not trust you," Nexphra murmured beside him, having noticed the exchange. "They believe outsiders bring ruin." "What should I do?" Kale asked, his voice low. "Prove them wrong," Nexphra replied simply. "Actions speak louder than doubts." With that, she led the way out of the palace, her warriors falling into formation behind her. Kale took a deep breath and followed, stepping into the unknown. As the gates closed behind them, sealing their path forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that this journey would change him forever. But one thing was certain: whatever happened next, he wouldn't face it alone. The day of departure arrived too quickly. The newly constructed ship gleamed under the morning light, its surface shimmering like liquid metal. Warriors, artisans, and even the youngest members of the hive gathered to bid Kale farewell. Though none spoke aloud, their gratitude radiated through the air, filling him with warmth. As Kale prepared to board, Nexphra stepped forward, placing a slender hand on his shoulder. "Remember this," she said, her mental voice steady but tinged with emotion. "No matter where you go or what challenges lie ahead, you carry a piece of us with you, as we carry a piece of you." Tears welled up in Kale's eyes, though he blinked them away before anyone could see. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." With a final nod, he climbed aboard the ship. As it ascended into the sky, Kale looked out the window, watching the palace grow smaller until it disappeared entirely. Yet even as distance separated him from the Jaluri, he could still feel their presence, a quiet hum in the back of his mind, a reminder of the bond they shared. Back on Earth, Kale became a legend. News of his encounter with the Jaluri spread rapidly, sparking both awe and skepticism. Some dismissed his story as fiction, while others embraced it as proof that humanity wasn't alone in the universe. Governments scrambled to establish contact, eager to learn more about these enigmatic beings. Through it all, Kale remained steadfast, using his experiences to advocate for peace and understanding. He traveled the globe, sharing tales of the Jaluri's culture, their struggles, and their resilience. Slowly but surely, humanity began to open its collective mind, seeing the potential for cooperation rather than conflict. Meanwhile, on the alien world, Nyxphra led her people into a new era of prosperity. Under her guidance, the Jalauri flourished, their society stronger and more united than ever before. Though she missed Cal deeply, she took solace in knowing that their bond transcended physical boundaries. Through their psychic connection, they continued to guide each other, ensuring that neither species faced the unknown alone. Years later, when the first official delegation from Earth arrived on the Jalauri homeworld, Kale stood beside Nyxphra, greeting them with a smile. Together, they ushered in a new chapter of interstellar diplomacy, one built on trust, respect, and mutual growth. And so, what had begun as a cosmic mishap ended as a testament to the power of courage, empathy, and unity. Two vastly different species, once strangers, had found common ground. And in doing so, they had changed the course of history forever. Nyxphra's expression softened ever so slightly. Your insight has already proven vital. Besides, she paused, her gaze piercing. You have shown courage when many would falter. That makes you one of us. Over the next few days, preparations for the mission intensified. Kale worked alongside Jalauri engineers to modify weapons and equipment, leveraging his technical expertise to adapt human designs to alien technology. He also trained with elite warriors, learning basic combat techniques and how to use advanced tools effectively. Though he wasn't nearly as skilled as the Jalauri, his resourcefulness earned their respect. As departure day approached, Kale found himself reflecting on everything that had happened since his arrival. He'd gone from being an accidental intruder to a key player in an interstellar conflict, yet doubts lingered in the back of his mind. Could he truly make a difference in a war so vast and complex? And what would become of him once the mission was over? On the eve of their journey, Kale wandered into the palace gardens, seeking solace beneath the glowing flora. To his surprise, Nyxphra joined him, her towering frame casting a gentle shadow over the vibrant plants. I know you doubt yourself, she said softly, breaking the silence. But doubt is not weakness. It is the foundation of growth. Trust in your abilities, Kale. We will face whatever lies ahead together. Her words filled him with a quiet strength. For the first time since arriving on this alien world, Kale felt like he truly belonged. Whatever challenges awaited them, he was ready to face them, not just for himself, but for the fragile alliance forming between humans and Jalauri. And somewhere deep inside, he allowed himself to hope, for peace, for understanding, and for a future where two vastly different species could stand side by side against the darkness. The journey into the heart of corruption began under a sky that seemed perpetually dark, streaked with veins of crimson lightning. The landscape was desolate, charred earth stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with jagged spires of blackened crystal that pulsed faintly with an ominous red glow. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the metallic tang of decay mixed with something far more sinister, a presence that made Cal's skin crawl. Nyxphra led the group, her towering form cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a beacon of hope. Behind her marched dozens of Jalauri warriors, their armor gleaming faintly despite the gloom. Cal walked near the front, flanked by two elite guards who kept a watchful eye on him. Though he'd earned their respect, he still felt out of place among these battle-hardened beings. Every step reminded him of how alien this world truly was, and how much was riding on his shoulders. As they ventured deeper into the wasteland, signs of the Voidborn's influence grew more pronounced. Twisted remnants of Jalauri structures jutted from the ground like broken bones, their once beautiful designs warped into grotesque shapes. Occasionally, they passed pools of viscous black liquid that bubbled ominously, releasing tendrils of smoke that writhed in unnatural patterns. Kale avoided looking directly at them. Something about those tendrils felt alive. The first attack came without warning. A deafening screech split the air, followed by the sudden appearance of Voidborn swarming from the shadows. Their jagged forms moved with unnatural speed, their corrupted bodies oozing ichor that sizzled where it touched the ground. Chaos erupted as the Jalauri warriors sprang into action, unleashing bursts of energy and slashing with razor-sharp claws. Kale raised his weapon, firing blindly at the nearest Voidborn. His aim was shaky at first, but adrenaline quickly steadied his hands. One creature lunged at him, its mangled face contorted in a silent scream. Kale fired a concentrated blast of energy straight into its chest, sending it crumbling to ash. He barely had time to catch his breath before another took its place. "Stay close," shouted one of the guards, shoving Kale behind a fallen spire just as a tendril of corruption whipped past, narrowly missing him. The guard retaliated with a burst of plasma, severing the tendril and causing it to dissolve into smoke. Through the chaos, Kale caught glimpses of Nyxphra. She fought with unmatched ferocity, her iridescent scales glowing brighter with each strike. Her attacks were precise and devastating, cutting through waves of Voidborn with ease. Yet even she couldn't hold back the tide indefinitely. More enemies poured in, forcing the group to retreat further into the abyss. After what felt like hours, the fighting subsided, leaving the survivors battered but alive. The cost had been high. Several warriors lay motionless on the ground, their bodies consumed by corruption. Kale knelt beside one of the fallen, his hands trembling as he reached out. But before he could touch the body, it disintegrated into ash, carried away by the wind. "We must keep moving," Nyxphra said firmly, though her voice betrayed a hint of sorrow. "Lingering here serves no purpose." Kale nodded numbly, pushing himself to his feet. They pressed onward, navigating treacherous terrain littered with traps laid by the Voidborn. At one point, the group stumbled upon a massive chasm filled with swirling darkness. A narrow bridge of crystalline material spanned the gap, its surface slick with ichor. Crossing it would be risky, but there was no other way forward. Over the next few days, Kale grew more accustomed to life within the alien palace. The guards kept a close watch on him, but they weren't cruel, just firm and unyielding. He was allowed to roam certain areas of the sprawling structure, though always under supervision. As he explored, Kale couldn't help but notice how vibrant and alive everything felt. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsating faintly with light that shifted colors depending on the time of day, or whatever passed for day in this alien world. Despite the beauty around him, Kale's mind remained restless. Nyxphra had been surprisingly open during their previous conversation, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Who were these Jolari? What was the Voidborn threat he'd overheard whispers about? And why did Nyxphra seem burdened by something she refused to discuss? One afternoon, while wandering through a section of the palace filled with towering shelves of glowing artifacts, Kale stumbled upon two drones deep in conversation. They hadn't noticed him yet, their attention focused on a holographic projection hovering between them. Intrigued, Kale ducked behind a nearby pillar, straining to listen. "The Voidborn grow stronger," one drone said in its guttural voice. "They've already taken 3 outlying colonies, and still Nyxphra does nothing," the other replied bitterly. "She hesitates, as if paralyzed by fear, or worse, complicity." Cal's breath caught in his throat. Complicity. Did they think their own queen was involved with whatever the Voidborn were? Before he could process this revelation, the second drone glanced toward his hiding spot. Kale quickly stepped back into view, pretending to examine a nearby artifact. When the drones turned away, muttering angrily, he slipped further down the corridor, his mind racing. Later that evening, Kale found himself summoned once again to Nyxphra's chamber. She stood near her obsidian throne, her iridescent scales glinting in the dim light. This time, however, her usual composure seemed strained. Her multifaceted eyes flickered with unease as she regarded Kale. "You have questions," she stated plainly, cutting straight to the point. Kale hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I've heard some of your people talking," he began cautiously. "About the Voidborn. What are they?" For a moment, Nyxphra didn't respond. Then, with a heavy sigh, she gestured for him to follow her. She led him to a secluded alcove where a large, circular portal hung suspended in midair. Within it swirled images of destruction, burnt landscapes, shattered structures, and creatures that looked eerily similar to the Jolari but twisted and corrupted, their forms jagged and malformed. "These are the Voidborn," Nyxferat explained, her mental voice tinged with sorrow. "Once they were Jolari like us, but centuries ago, a great calamity fractured our hive mind, the collective consciousness that binds us together. Those who fell victim to the fracture became something else, twisted echoes of what we once were." Kale stared at the horrific images, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Why haven't you stopped them?" he asked quietly. "It is not so simple," Nyxferat replied. "The Voidborn are relentless, driven by chaos and hunger. Every attempt to confront them has ended in failure. Many believe we should abandon the outer territories and retreat deeper into our domain. But doing so would mean sacrificing countless lives, including those who cannot flee." Her words carried a weight that made Cal's chest tighten. For all her power and authority, Nyxferat was trapped between impossible choices. He realized then that her hesitation wasn't cowardice. It was the burden of leadership. "I'm sorry," Kale said sincerely. "I can't imagine what that must feel like." Nyxferat studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "You are strange, human," she murmured. "Most would cower or demand answers, yet you offer empathy instead." Before Cal could respond, the ground beneath them trembled violently. Alarms blared throughout the palace, piercing the air with an urgent wail. Nyxferat's eyes widened, and she turned sharply toward the window. Outside, the sky darkened as swarms of Voidborn descended upon the palace, their corrupted forms blotting out the light. "Stay here," Nyxferat commanded, her voice sharp and commanding once more. Without waiting for a reply, she sprinted toward the exit, her movements swift and purposeful. Kale watched her go, his heart pounding. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the fragile peace he'd witnessed was about to shatter, and he might not survive to see what came next. Kel Armitage was not a hero. He wasn't even particularly brave or smart, just an ordinary maintenance worker trying to make ends meet aboard the cargo freighter Eos. The ship was old, creaking with every jump through hyperspace, but it got the job done. Kel's days were filled with fixing broken panels, replacing faulty wiring, and dodging the grumpy engineers who thought he was too slow for their liking. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid enough to keep him fed and alive. That day started like any other. The crew had been tasked with delivering supplies to a remote mining colony on the edge of human-occupied space. Kale was in the engineering bay, tinkering with a navigation array that kept shorting out. "Probably another loose connection," he muttered under his breath as he opened the panel. But what he found inside wasn't a loose wire. It was something far stranger. Nestled among the tangled circuits was a small device marked with symbols Kale didn't recognize. It hummed faintly, its surface glowing faintly blue. Curiosity got the better of him. He tapped it lightly with his screwdriver, expecting nothing more than a harmless spark. Instead, the device roared to life, emitting a high-pitched whine that made his ears ring. Before Cal could react, the room around him began to distort, twisting into impossible shapes, as if reality itself were melting. "What the?" Cal shouted, stumbling backward. His tools clattered to the floor as the device unleashed a swirling vortex of light and energy. The pull was irresistible. Cal felt himself being dragged toward the center of the chaos. He clawed at the walls, desperate to hold on, but the force was too strong. With one final scream, he disappeared into the vortex. When Cal opened his eyes, everything was different. Gone were the cold metal corridors of the Eos. In their place stretched an alien landscape unlike anything he'd ever seen. Towering crystalline structures jutted from the ground, pulsating with soft, bioluminescent light. The air smelled strange, metallic yet sweet, and the sky above shimmered with colors no human eye should have been able to perceive. For a moment, Cal forgot how to breathe. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice trembling. He tried to stand, but his legs wobbled beneath him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to find shelter, but there was nowhere to go. Then he saw them, the creatures. They scuttled across the terrain like oversized insects, their bodies covered in chitinous armor that gleamed in the dim light. Some moved on 6 legs, others floated eerily above the ground. None of them seemed to notice Kel at first. But then one of the smaller ones paused mid-step, its multifaceted eyes locking onto him. A shrill shriek pierced the air, and suddenly all the creatures turned toward him. Panic surged through Kel's veins. Without thinking, he bolted, weaving between the crystal spires as fast as his legs could carry him. Behind him, the creatures gave chase, their claws scraping against the ground. His heart pounded in his chest, each breath burning his lungs. Just when he thought he couldn't run anymore, he spotted an opening, a massive archway leading into what looked like a cavernous chamber beyond. With no time to think, Kel dove through the archway, slamming into the ground as he landed. When he looked up, his jaw dropped. The room was enormous, its walls shimmering like liquid gold. Strange organic patterns shifted and pulsed as though alive. At the center stood a colossal throne, carved from obsidian-like material, atop which sat the most breathtaking and terrifying creature Kel had ever seen. She was tall and slender, her elongated form adorned with iridescent scales that refracted light into dazzling hues. Her multifaceted eyes locked onto Kel, freezing him in place. Before he could move, she rose gracefully from her throne, her movements fluid and deliberate. To Kel's astonishment, she didn't attack or devour him. Instead, she tilted her head curiously, studying him as though he were some rare artifact. A voice invaded his mind, smooth yet commanding. "You are unexpected." Kel swallowed hard, his throat dry. Whatever this place was, and whoever this creature was, he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. The night before the mission, Kel found it impossible to sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead, the dangers they would face, the lives at stake, and the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He sat cross-legged on the floor of his quarters, staring at the glowing orb suspended from the ceiling. Its light flickered faintly, casting shifting patterns across the walls. For a moment, he wondered if the orb was alive, watching him just as he watched it. A soft knock at the door startled him out of his reverie. Before he could respond, it slid open, revealing Nixpra. She stood in the doorway, her iridescent scales catching the dim light, making her look almost ethereal. Her usual regal demeanor was softened tonight, replaced by something more vulnerable, something human. "May I enter?" she asked telepathically, her voice gentle. Kel nodded quickly, scrambling to his feet. Of course. Nixpra stepped inside, her movements graceful as always. She glanced around the small room, taking in its simplicity. The silken platform, the glowing orb, the faint hum of energy coursing through the walls. Then she turned her attention back to Kel, her multifaceted eyes studying him intently. "You are troubled," she observed, stating the obvious but somehow making it sound profound. Kel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I guess you could say that. I mean, we're about to go up against something none of us fully understands. What if I mess things up? What if my ideas don't work?" Nexfra tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "Fear is natural," she replied. "Even queens feel it. But fear unchecked becomes paralysis. Fear embraced becomes strength." Her words struck a chord within Kel. He thought about all the times he doubted himself, not just here among the Jolari, but back on Earth too. How often had he let fear hold him back? And yet here he was, standing shoulder to shoulder with beings who trusted him enough to follow his lead. "I'm not used to people relying on me," Kel admitted quietly. "Back home, I was just ordinary. No one expected much from me. And yet, here you are," Nixpra said, her tone carrying a note of admiration. "Ordinary men do not survive wormholes, earn the trust of alien queens, or devise strategies to save entire civilizations. You underestimate yourself, Kel Armitage. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. Instead, it felt comforting, like a shared understanding passing between two unlikely allies. Kel realized then that Nyxra wasn't just speaking to him. She was reminding herself of the same truths. Even queens needed reassurance sometimes. "Why are you doing this?" Kel asked suddenly, surprising even himself. "Not just letting me help, but trusting me so completely. You barely know me." Nyxra hesitated, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was tinged with sadness. "Because I have no choice. My people look to me for guidance, but I am only one being. The burden of leadership grows heavier with each passing cycle. Your arrival, it feels like a sign. Chance to rewrite our fate." Kel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. It wasn't just about defeating the Voidborn anymore. It was about restoring hope to Nyxra, to the Jalari, and perhaps even to himself. As dawn approached, Kel joined the others in the palace's central chamber, where preparations were underway. Warriors clad in shimmering armor gathered in disciplined ranks, their weapons humming softly. Engineers tinkered with equipment, ensuring everything was ready for deployment. The air buzzed with anticipation, a mix of excitement and dread. Nyxra addressed the assembly, her commanding presence drawing everyone's attention. "Tomorrow, we march toward the heart of corruption," she declared, her telepathic voice resonating throughout the chamber. "We'd fight not only for survival but for redemption, for ourselves, for our fallen kin, and for the future of our hive. Together, we will reclaim what has been lost." Months passed, and the scars of war began to heal, not just on the alien world but within Kel himself. The once barren wasteland now teemed with life, its crystalline spires glowing brightly once more. Patches of vibrant flora spread across the landscape, their luminescent petals swaying gently in the breeze. Even the air felt lighter, carrying the sweet scent of renewal rather than decay. It was as if the planet itself had been reborn alongside its people. Kel stood at the edge of a balcony overlooking the palace gardens, watching as Jalari artisans worked tirelessly to restore what had been lost. Their movements were fluid and purposeful, blending artistry with functionality. Nearby, children played among the glowing plants, their laughter echoing through the air. For the first time since his arrival, Kel felt a sense of peace, a fragile yet undeniable hope for the future. Behind him, Nyxra approached silently, her iridescent scales catching the light of the twin suns setting on the horizon. She paused beside him, her multifaceted eyes reflecting the colors of the sky. "You have done well," she said telepathically, her voice warm with pride. "The hive thrives because of your courage." Kel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I didn't do it alone. You and your people fought just as hard, if not harder." Nyxra tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Perhaps, but you reminded us of something we have forgotten. That strength lies not only in unity but also in trust, in opening ourselves to new ideas and new allies." Her words struck a chord within Kel. He thought back to the countless moments when he doubted himself, wondering if he truly belonged here. Now, standing beside Nyxra, surrounded by beings who saw him not as an outsider, but as one of their own, he realized how far he'd come. From a lowly maintenance worker lost in space to a key figure in an interstellar alliance, his journey had transformed him in ways he never imagined. But as much as he cherished this newfound home, Kel knew his story wasn't over. Earth still awaited him, or at least, the memory of it did. His thoughts often drifted to humanity, wondering how they would react to news of the Jalari. Would they embrace them as friends, or would fear drive them apart? One evening, as the stars began to twinkle above the palace, Nyxra summoned Kel to her chamber. There, she revealed plans for a vessel unlike any other, a ship designed to bridge the gap between their worlds. Sleek and elegant, It combined human engineering with Jolari technology, symbolizing the bond they had forged. "This is your mission now," Nyxferat explained, her tone firm yet gentle. "To return to your kind and share our story. To show them that coexistence is possible and necessary." Kale stared at the holographic blueprint of the ship, his heart swelling with emotion. "And what about you?" he asked quietly. "Will you be okay without me?" Nyxfer's expression softened, a rare flicker of vulnerability crossing her features. "I will miss you," she admitted, "but I know you must go. Your place is not solely here. It is wherever your heart calls you." The aftermath of the Voidborn attack left the palace in ruins. Crystalline spires that had once shimmered with life now lay shattered, their glow extinguished. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burnt corruption. Jolari warriors moved among the wreckage, tending to the injured and collecting the remains of fallen comrades. Despite the devastation, there was a sense of grim determination in their movements, a refusal to let despair take hold. Kale sat on a low platform near the main entrance, his body sore and his mind reeling. He still clutched the energy weapon he'd used during the battle, its surface warm from repeated firing. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at it, half expecting another wave of Voidborn to appear out of nowhere. But for now, the immediate threat had passed. Nyxfera approached him, her regal presence commanding even amidst the chaos. Her iridescent scales were dulled by soot and ash, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made Kale straighten unconsciously. She studied him for a moment before speaking telepathically. "You have earned my trust," she said simply, her voice carrying both gratitude and resolve. "But this victory is temporary. The Voidborn will return. And next time, we may not be so fortunate." Kale nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "What can I do?" he asked. "I'm just me, a mechanic from Earth who got lost in space." Nyxfera tilted her head, considering him. "You underestimate yourself. Your ingenuity turned the tide today, and your perspective, untainted by our hive mind, is invaluable. Together, we must prepare for what comes next." Her plan became clear over the following days. Nyxferat called a council of her most trusted advisors and warriors, including Kale, to strategize against the Voidborn. The chamber buzzed with heated discussions as ideas were proposed and debated. Some argued for fortifying the palace, while others suggested abandoning it entirely and retreating deeper into Jolari territory. But Kale noticed a recurring theme in their conversations: fear. Fear of failure, fear of loss, and above all, fear of the unknown. When it was his turn to speak, Kale hesitated. These were beings far older and wiser than him. What could he possibly contribute? But then he remembered something Nyxfera had told him earlier, that survival alone does not define greatness. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "We can't keep running or hiding," he began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "If the Voidborn are corrupted versions of your people, then maybe the solution isn't just about fighting them. It's about healing them, or at least finding a way to stop the corruption from spreading." The room fell silent. Nyxfera's advisors exchanged skeptical glances, murmuring amongst themselves. One elder drone finally spoke up, its tone dismissive. "Healing the Voidborn? Impossible. They are beyond redemption." Kale shook his head firmly. "Maybe they are now, but what if we find the source of the corruption? If we can figure out how it started, maybe we can reverse it, or at least contain it." Nyxfera regarded him thoughtfully, her multifaceted eyes gleaming with renewed interest. "Go on," she prompted. Kale continued, growing more confident as he spoke. "From what I've seen, the Voidborn seem drawn to certain areas, places where those crystals are strongest. Maybe those crystals aren't just power sources. Maybe they're amplifying the corruption somehow. If we disable enough of them, or find a way to alter their frequency, we might weaken the Voidborn permanently." The council erupted into murmurs again, this time tinged with cautious optimism. Even the skeptical elder seemed intrigued. Nyxferat rose from her seat, silencing the room with a single gesture. "Cal's suggestion merits exploration," she declared. "We will divide our forces. Some will remain here to repair and defend the palace, while others, including myself, will seek the origin of the corruption. Cal, you will accompany us." Cal blinked in surprise. "Me? Are you sure?" Cal sat on the soft, silken platform in his makeshift quarters, staring at the glowing orbs suspended from the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of energy coursing through the walls. It felt alive, as though the very structure of the palace pulsed with some unseen heartbeat. Despite the strangeness of his surroundings, Cal couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by the guards outside his door, but by something far more intelligent. He tried to focus on practical thoughts. How could he escape? Where was Earth in relation to this alien world? Could he even survive long enough to find a way back? But no matter how hard he tried to think logically, his mind kept drifting back to Nyxphra, the alien queen who had spared his life. There was something about her that intrigued him, something beyond her terrifying beauty and commanding presence. She hadn't acted like a monster. She'd been curious, almost human. The sound of the door opening snapped Cal out of his thoughts. Two drones entered the room, their insectoid bodies clicking softly as they moved. One carried a tray filled with strange foods, glowing fruits, gelatinous blobs, and what looked like steaming liquid in a crystalline container. The other held a bundle of fabric that shimmered like water under sunlight. "Food," one of the drones said gruffly, placing the tray on a nearby table. "Clothing. You will wear these when summoned." Cal hesitated before approaching the tray. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he wasn't sure if the food was safe to eat. Still, he reasoned that if Nyxphra wanted him dead, she wouldn't have gone through the trouble of feeding him. He picked up one of the glowing fruits cautiously and took a small bite. To his surprise, it tasted sweet, like a mix of honey and citrus, and left a warm sensation in his chest. As he ate, Cal examined the clothing. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, lightweight yet sturdy, with patterns that seemed to shift depending on the angle of light. He changed into it reluctantly, feeling self-conscious as the fabric clung to him perfectly, accentuating his lean frame. Not long after, the drones returned to escort him once again. This time, they led him deeper into the palace, past corridors adorned with intricate carvings and pulsating crystals. Cal marveled at the blend of technology and nature. Vines intertwined with metallic beams, and pools of luminescent liquid illuminated the halls. The entire structure felt like a living organism rather than a building. They arrived at a grand hall where Nyxphra awaited him. She stood near a massive window overlooking the alien landscape, her iridescent scales catching the light in mesmerizing ways. When she turned to face him, Cal noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. Gone was the cold curiosity from their first encounter. Now, there was a hint of warmth, or at least acknowledgement, in her multifaceted eyes. "You adapt quickly," Nyxphra said telepathically, her voice softer than before. "Few would remain calm in your position." Cal shrugged awkwardly, unsure how to respond. "I guess I don't have much choice." Nyxphra tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Tell me about your kind. Humans, what drives you?" For a moment, Cal was taken aback. He hadn't expected her to ask such a personal question. "Well," he began hesitantly, "we're explorers, builders. We've always wanted to understand the universe, even if we don't always get it right. Sometimes we fight each other, sometimes we work together. Mostly, we just survive." Nyxphra listened intently, her expression unreadable. "Survival is universal," she said after a pause. "But survival alone does not define greatness." The palace erupted into chaos as the Voidborn attack intensified. The once serene halls were now filled with the sounds of alarms, screeching drones, and the thunderous impacts of corrupted creatures smashing through crystalline walls. Cal stood frozen in Nyxphra's chamber, his mind racing. He knew he should stay put. It was what she'd ordered. But the thought of doing nothing while everyone else fought felt unbearable. Peering cautiously out of the alcove, Kale saw Jaluri warriors rushing past, their armored bodies glowing faintly as they prepared for battle. Some carried sleek weapons that hummed with energy, while others wielded sharp claws or tails tipped with venomous barbs. Despite their alien appearance, there was no mistaking the determination in their movements. They weren't just fighting to survive. They were defending their home. Kale clenched his fists, torn between fear and a growing sense of responsibility. "You're not one of them," a voice in his head whispered. "You don't belong here." But another part of him, the part that had seen Nyxphra's vulnerability, heard her doubts, knew he couldn't stand idly by. If nothing else, he owed it to her to try. Steeling himself, Kale stepped out of the chamber and followed the flow of warriors toward the source of the commotion. Along the way, he grabbed a discarded weapon from the floor, a small handheld device that pulsed with blue light. It didn't look like much, but when he pressed a button on its side, a bolt of energy shot out, striking a nearby wall and leaving a smoking crater. Good enough, he thought grimly. By the time Kale reached the main entrance, the scene was apocalyptic. Voidborn swarmed the area, their jagged forms clashing violently with the defenders. The air crackled with energy as beams of light collided with dark tendrils of corruption. Shards of crystal rained down from shattered spires, glittering dangerously in the dim light. Amidst the chaos, Kale spotted Nyxphra at the forefront of the battle, her iridescent scales gleaming as she unleashed devastating blasts of energy from her hands. For all her grace, Nyxphra fought with ferocity, cutting through waves of Voidborn with precision and power. Yet even she couldn't hold back the tide alone. More and more Voidborn poured into the palace, their numbers seemingly endless. Kale watched in horror as several Jaluri warriors fell, their bodies consumed by the same corruption that twisted their enemies. Summoning every ounce of courage, Kale joined the fray. At first, his aim was shaky, and his shots missed more often than they hit. But as adrenaline surged through him, he began to find his rhythm. A Voidborn lunged at him, its mangled form oozing black ichor. Kale fired instinctively, hitting it square in the chest. The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek before collapsing into ash. "Not bad for a human," a gruff voice said behind him. Kale turned to see one of the insectoid guards who had escorted him earlier. Its multifaceted eyes glinted approvingly. "Keep moving. Stay alive." Kale nodded, grateful for the unexpected encouragement. Together, they pushed forward, carving a path through the chaos. As the battle raged on, Kale noticed something strange about the Voidborn. They seemed drawn to certain areas of the palace, particularly sections where glowing crystals pulsed most brightly. It was almost as if they were feeding off the energy. An idea sparked in Kale's mind. Grabbing a fallen Jaluri warrior's communicator, he shouted over the din, "Nyxphra. The crystals. They are fueling them. We need to shut them down." Nyxphra heard him despite the noise. Her gaze locked onto his for a brief moment before she barked orders to her troops. Several warriors broke away from the main fight, heading toward the crystal nodes scattered throughout the palace. Kale followed close behind, using his weapon to cover their retreat. One by one, the warriors disabled the crystals, plunging parts of the palace into darkness. With each node destroyed, the Voidborn grew weaker, their attacks becoming sluggish and disorganized. By the time the last crystal went dark, the invaders had been reduced to smoldering husks. Breathing heavily, Kale leaned against a crumbling pillar, his body aching from exertion. Around him, the surviving Jaluri regrouped, tending to their wounded and surveying the damage. Nyxphra approached him, her expression unreadable. "You disobeyed my order," she said, her telepathic voice calm but firm. "I know," Kale replied, meeting her gaze, "but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing." To his surprise, Nyxphra's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "Your actions saved lives today, human. Perhaps you are more than just unexpected." As the dust settled, Kale realized something profound. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was making a difference. And maybe, just maybe, he belonged here after all. Cale froze, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure the creature could hear it. She loomed over him, her towering frame casting an eerie shadow across the golden walls of the chamber. Her iridescent scales shimmered with every subtle movement, making her seem almost otherworldly. But what unnerved Cale most were her eyes. Multifaceted and sharp, they seemed to pierce straight through him, reading his thoughts before he even had time to form them. The voice in his mind spoke again, calm but firm. "You are unexpected." It wasn't a question, nor a threat. It was more like curiosity wrapped in authority. Cale opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, his brain struggling to process the situation. Who are you?" he finally managed to stammer, his voice barely above a whisper. The creature tilted her head slightly, as if amused by his fear. "I am Nixfra," she replied telepathically, her tone carrying an air of regality. "Ruler of the Jolari Hive." Cale blinked, trying to make sense of what she'd said. Jolari Hive? None of it made any sense. All he knew was that he'd somehow ended up in this alien world. And now, standing face to face with its ruler, he wasn't sure whether to feel terrified or awestruck. Nixfra stepped down from her throne, her movements graceful and deliberate. Despite her intimidating appearance, there was something oddly mesmerizing about her. She didn't lunge at him or bare fangs like some monstrous predator. Instead, she studied him with an intensity that suggested genuine interest. "How did you come here?" she asked, her mental voice probing gently. Cale hesitated. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? I don't know," he admitted. "There was this thing on my ship. A device. I touched it. And then..." He gestured vaguely, unsure how to finish the sentence. Nixfra's gaze narrowed slightly, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Cale feared she might decide he was too much trouble and dispose of him. But then, to his surprise, she turned away, pacing slowly around the chamber. "This is unprecedented," she murmured, though Cale couldn't tell if she was speaking to him or herself. "No outsider has ever breached our domain without being destroyed." Her words sent a chill down Cale's spine. Destroyed. What did that mean exactly? Was he only alive because Nixfra found him interesting, or was there another reason? Before Cale could ask, Nixfra raised one slender hand, signaling for silence. Two smaller creatures entered the room. Guards, Cale guessed, judging by their armored bodies and menacing claws. They moved with precision, flanking him on either side. Cale instinctively backed up, raising his hands defensively. "They will escort you," Nixfra said, turning her attention back to him. "For now, you will remain unharmed. Do not test my patience." Cale nodded quickly, swallowing hard. "Okay. Got it. No testing your patience." With that, the guards ushered him out of the chamber, leaving Nixfra alone with her thoughts. As they led him through winding corridors lined with glowing crystals, Cale couldn't help but marvel at the alien architecture. Everything seemed alive, pulsating faintly as though synchronized with some unseen heartbeat. Even the air smelled different here, a mix of metallic tang and something sweet, almost floral. Despite the awe-inspiring surroundings, Cale's mind raced with questions. Who were these Jolari? Why hadn't they killed him yet? And what did Nixfra mean when she said outsiders were usually destroyed? Most importantly, how was he going to get back home? As they walked, Cale noticed other creatures watching him from the shadows. Some were insectoid like the ones outside, while others looked completely different. Floating orbs of light, serpentine beings slithering along the walls, even humanoid figures draped in shimmering robes. None of them approached, but their stares followed him everywhere, making him feel like an exhibit in some bizarre zoo. Finally, the guard stopped in front of a large door carved with intricate patterns. One of them pressed a claw against the surface, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside was a small room filled with strange furniture. Low platforms covered in silken fabrics, glowing orbs suspended from the ceiling, and shelves lined with objects Kel couldn't begin to identify. "This is where you will stay," one of the guards said, their voice deep and guttural. Unlike Nick's for his telepathic communication, this felt raw and primal. Cale nodded nervously. Thanks." The guards left without another word, sealing the door behind them. Alone in the room, Cale sank onto one of the platforms, letting out a shaky breath. He had survived, for now, but he knew this was far from over. Whatever fate awaited him, he would need to keep his wits about him if he wanted to make it out alive. And somewhere deep inside, a tiny part of him wondered if,